So we're almost done with our router reducer. However, to actually get things working, we need to provide what we call a custom serializer. Now, the custom serializer is essentially past the router state, and what we can essentially do is take some of the properties off of the router snapshot, and then we can bind those to the store. So when you, for instance, inject something like the activated route, you can obtain a snapshot, which is what the router state looks like at that point in time. So what we need to do is jump into our index.ts where we have set up this router reducer. Now what we're going to do before we get started is we need to import a few things from the top. What we want to import alongside our params, we want the activated route snapshot, and we also want the router state snapshot. Now again, these few videos are just simply setting up the boilerplate necessary that we need. Once the boilerplate is ready, we don't have to do this again. We can carry out building the rest of our application. These are things that we typically have to set up, and at times it does take quite a long time to actually set these things up, but the power comes from after we've set it up. I would highly recommend that we use this approach, which is why we're definitely including it in this course. So we're going to be rolling our own custom serializer. You can in fact go into the NGRX documentation and find this stuff, but I'd rather teach you how we can actually write it ourselves rather than you just looking at the code and assuming what it does. We want to actually understand it. And when you build out your own application, it might be that we adjust the custom serializer to give you your own properties that you need for a specific use case. So now that we've imported these, what we can do is jump down to the bottom where we're going to create this custom serializer. So essentially what we want to do is export a class, and we're going to call this the custom serializer. Now this is simply a class which has a serialize method on it. Now we can make sure that we are doing things properly, and we can implement an interface. Now we already have one interface where we're saying we have the from router, router reducer state, and then the router state URL. So we're actually going to create something slightly similar. So we're going to say it implements from the router, and this will then give us a few options. We can then select the router state serializer and give that a generic type. What I'll do is hide the sidebar so we can see this more clearly. Now we want to pass in the router state URL as the generic type, and then we can save that out. Now what this will do is actually put this onto a new line because the line length is quite long. So Prettier is actually putting this on a new line for us. Now the serialize function actually gets given what we can call the router state, and that is essentially going to match against Angular's router state snapshot. So this is what we imported above, and we actually get that from the Angular router. So that's the type of what we're going to be passed. We could actually just take a quick dive into the source code, and you can see here that we have this router state snapshot. We have the URL, which we can grab, but this also extends a tree which has the activated route snapshot. So let's have a look at this. We can actually look, we can have the URL segments, we've got params, query params. So when you're building your own application, it might be that you need such as the fragment, or you need to know what outlet or the component. You can take these properties, and we'll show you how to bind these to your own store using this custom serializer. So we need the custom serializer, there's no choice, we have to implement it. Now what we need to do, and you can see this red underline because we're not actually returning anything. So what we need to do is actually return something, and the thing that we need to return is in fact our router state URL. So we can actually declare this, and we can add the return type and say that we're going to return the router state URL. And you can see that TypeScript is flagging this because we're not actually returning anything. So what we need to do is compose a new object based on the properties of the router. So what we'll do down here is return a brand new object, and we'll just leave it like so for now. Now what we want to do is return a few properties. We want to return the URL, some query params, and some params. Like I said before, you can extend this to create your own properties, but we're going to stick with these three for now. So what we're going to say is that we want to get the URL from the router state. So we're going to say const. Now instead of using const URL, what we're actually going to do is destructure the URL from the router state itself. So this is the equivalent to doing something like this, where we do router state.url. So that's what we're pretty much doing. We're just using a cleaner syntax with ES6 to actually destructure it. And if you're not sure how this actually works, this is exactly the same as what this is doing here. This is destructuring an import. We're saying we just want this, we just want this, and we just want this. Whereas when we use something like this, it will import everything from there. Now what we can do now is pass the URL to the returned object, because that's all we need for that one piece of state, which we know if we check above, we can see that the URL is just a string. So this returned object is actually what is going to be bound to NGRX store's state tree. So it's important that we get this right, and it's important for you to actually understand this. So the next thing, let's go ahead and grab the query params. What we can do is const, and we can use some destructuring. We can say query params, and then we can say equals the router state dot root. So that's where that's going to come from. We don't actually need to do anything for that. We can just simply bind it to our object. Now the next bit becomes a little bit more interesting, because the way that the router actually works is it is a state tree of itself, which means that we actually need to traverse the state tree. We're not going to go into too much detail, but we're going to just kind of explain the concepts of what's happening so you can understand where we're actually obtaining this information from. So what we can say is let state. Now we're using the let statement because we actually want to reassign it. We're going to use a while loop. Then we're going to say the activated root snapshot. So I'm going to choose this one here. So it's going to be of type activated root snapshot. Now we can get that initial state from the router state, and you can see that we have a few options. We get that from the root. Now because the router is in fact a state tree, means that we can iterate this state tree. So what we can typically use is a while loop for this. So we can say state, and because we are typed, we can see that we have this first child. Now this may look similar to what we just looked at in the TypeScript definition file, where I mentioned that you could grab a fragment, you could grab the component, the outlet, or anything else. So any of these properties are available for you to place in your own custom serializer if you need to. So what we actually want is the first child. So this will actually allow us to keep iterating through the router state tree by itself. This isn't the state tree to do with NGRX. This is the state tree of Angular's router. And we're essentially hijacking it and taking a few properties and then binding that to our NGRX store. So that's what's happening. So while we have a first child, that means that we have child roots. So for instance, we have /products/1, which means that we need to iterate a few times to be able to go and get that root param. So while we have a first child, the state is then going to be equal to the state.firstChild. So then each time we can then keep running the while loop, and when we get to the end, we can actually grab those params. So we can say const params equals the state.params. Now we could optionally say that we want to destructure this and leave it like so. Now the final thing we need to do is pass this params like so we can return this as a brand new object. So this object, and it's very important to remember this, is the object that is going to be bound to our state tree. Now the router store project, which is part of the NGRX project, will actually listen to Angular's routing events. Anytime you navigate somewhere or Angular navigates somewhere or something changes in the URL, this whole function is going to be called, which means that we get the new state representation of where we are in the application at all times. So it's important to remember that piece. So we're pretty much done here. We've created the custom serializer. We just need to hook a few things up, and then we're ready to go and actually see this working. So what we'll do, we can close this file off and jump into our app module. What we need to do is register our custom serializer, and then we also need to use the store router connecting module, which is given to us by the router store. This allows us to pick up on any changes via the routing navigation. So what we can do is jump up the top, and we'll import this above here. So we need to say that we want to import the store router connecting module. Keep an eye on the cases there. We've got a couple of upper cases, and we get these from NGRX/router store. So that's where that's coming from. The final one that we actually want to import is the router state serializer. Now when I save this will put this on a couple of lines just to keep the line length nice and readable for you. So the first thing is we need to actually register this in our ng module. This will actually register that module so the router package can then keep our state updated in our state tree. The next thing that we need to do is go and import our custom serializer because we need to go and register it. So next to the reducers, we can say custom and the word comes up. We've got our custom serializer. We can just double check. We can click through and we can see our custom serializer. So what we'll do, now that we've got this, we need to actually provide this. Now this ties in with Angular's dependency injection. So what we're going to do is essentially provide a router state serializer and use our own custom serializer. So let's jump down into our ng module and we can configure the providers, which will be an array. So inside here, we actually want to say that we want to provide the router state serializer and we want to use a class, and the class that we want to use is our custom serializer. So I'll hide the sidebar just so you can see that more clearly. We're registering a provider, we're providing the router state serializer, and we're actually saying use our class, our custom serializer. So when our store router connecting module actually internally uses this particular token, we are essentially replacing it with our own. So we are in full control of what gets bound to our state tree. So once you've done that, we'll save it out and we'll go to the browser, and we won't actually visually see anything, but what we can do is open up the Redux DevTools and have a look at our state tree and how we've connected all of the dots. So back in the browser, we can see pretty much what we've seen before. However, there's one subtle difference, and if you've seen it already, it's this router navigation event, which has just been fired. So that NGRX router store package is actually dispatching an event called the router navigation, and you can see that if we open up this raw representation, we have the router reducer, and it contains a new state. So we have the state, our URL, we have the products because we're at /products. At the moment, we don't have any query params or we don't have any typical root params. Now we can actually demonstrate the updating of this. So we'll click on a pizza. We can see this new router navigation event has just been fired. So let's open this one up. We can see that the navigation ID has been incremented to 2. So what this means is every time you navigate, we're just incrementing this number. This is kind of a tracker. If we refresh, this will reset to 1. Typically, we won't use this state. We're just interested in what's inside our state tree. So at this point in time, you can see that the state tree has updated the params with an ID of 1, and the URL has also been updated to reflect that. So what we're actually going to use, instead of doing something like this.root.params.subscribe in this component, we can just simply use our selectors and compose the state. And what we're going to do is grab this ID and pass it off to our entities so we can match up which pizza we're currently viewing. Hopefully that makes more sense. If not, we're going to connect the dots in the next couple of videos, and I'm excited to actually finish this piece because this is a great piece to actually get running with NGRX.